Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Dynamics 365 Cutover and Remote Go Live Strategy. My name is Erin, and I will be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you are agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenter or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our moderators will be responding to your questions during the presentation. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Ajit Kotwal, Principal Solution Architect, and we have Christopher Lim and Reed Wolf, Senior Solution Architects, here to answer your questions today. Ajit, over to you to kick us off.
Erin, thank you very much, and everyone, welcome to this Cutover and Remote Go Live Strategy Tech Talk. We have a lot of content to go through today, so I will be going through this pretty quickly, but please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A panel, and Christopher and Reed will be trying to answer your questions interactively as we go through this session. The objectives for this tech talk, essentially, it is to kind of help with some recommended practices to give you a reliable transition from your current legacy systems to Dynamics 365 applications. I won't read through the rest of them. You can read them themselves, but that essentially is the core objective. We won't cover detailed guidance on kind of technical data migration steps, because that's already covered elsewhere. We will touch upon data migration, but more in the context of a cutover strategy. How should we be thinking about data migration in the broader picture of a cutover? And we also won't cover transition to support, which again will be a separate tech talk. So our agenda is essentially broken down into 4 pieces. We'll start with the definition of a cutover strategy, vision, and what do we mean by a good cutover strategy. We'll then dip into data migration considerations, because data migration clearly is a key part of the cutover. Then we'll talk about the planning for the cutover, and then finally we'll talk about the go live period. And we'll touch upon, specific considerations if your go live is going to be a remote go live. Given the amount of content, I don't think we'll have time for a separate Q&A. But please, as I said earlier, do ask your questions in the panel. I'm also going to suggest that I'm going to go through the content relatively quickly. If there are areas that you feel deserve a deeper dive, require a bit more conversation, please let us know through the feedback, and we will then create another deeper dive tech talk to address the areas that you believe deserve more context or more definition. So let me start with an overall approach, and I will come back to this slide and this view a little bit later on in this tech talk. So essentially, if you think of the project in terms of kind of 4 big buckets: the initiate phase, the implement phase, the prepare to go live phase, and the operate phase, we're looking at saying during the initiate phase, you would be defining your cutover vision, the principles you're going to be following, the definition of the cutover leader and their role, getting your high-level cutover strategy defined, and as part of that, defining your business-focused calendar. And we'll go into more detail about what each of those mean from a Microsoft perspective. And then in the implement phase, we'd be looking at how we evolve the business-focused calendar, how we detail the cutover strategy in a bit more detail, go into more detail of the data migration and the mock cutovers, the mock data migrations, And then in the prepare phase, we'll go into a little bit more detail about, as you're getting ready for go live, what does that mean? What does that preparation look like? How should we be thinking about getting ready for the go live? And then not forgetting that for many cutover processes, that does not end at go live. There are often tasks that you need to do as part of cutover after you've gone live. And we'll be covering some of those as well. But as I said earlier, we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this chart once we've gone through some of the other detail. Let me start with the definition of a cutover in the framework that we're going to be discussing today. So we're defining cutover as the process of transition from current systems to Dynamics 365 business applications. And the key word here is process. That it's an evolution, the cutover. It's not an event that happens at the end of the project as part of go live. Another thing to remember is that a cutover strategy in our definition here is essentially transitioning not just the data from the legacy system to the Dynamics 365 system, but you're actually also moving business processes, system functionality, integrations with other systems, and you're also taking people with you, right? People who were using the old system and now going to be using the new system. Now, clearly, as part of cutover, data is a major part of that delivery, but it's not the only part. Right? So one of the things that we want to talk about is to say that cutover strategy is not just the detailed plan for the final cutover weekend or whatever your final shutdown period is, and it's not just data migration. And we're going to go through some of the other areas we think projects should be covering. So we want to start with, how do we put together the cutover strategy? What do we mean by that? What is there in addition to the kind of data migration requirements? So we want to start with kind of making a recommendation that think about having a cutover leader that you nominate from the business. And the idea behind that is that this cutover leader gives a unified vision of what needs to happen as part of the cutover. There are multiple disciplines involved in the cutover. It's the data migration teams, it's the change management teams, it's the business teams that need to validate it, it's the partner teams, sometimes there are ISVs involved. There's lots of different parties involved in that process. And not just for the final cutover, but also for the interim periods, for when you need data for testing, for training, etc. There are multiple parties involved in that as well. And having a cutover leader that you nominate from the business helps you unify that vision, helps you have somebody who is now the liaison with the business as well. Right? And having that single cutover leader then allows you to also provide a business perspective to the cutover and not just a technical data migration perspective. The second thing we'd recommend is to think about having a vision for the cutover as part of the initial cutover strategy. And this is in the initiate phase, right? This is right at the beginning of the project. So you're defining what is it from a business perspective you're expecting to get out of the cutover, right? And not just the transition, but in a bit more detail, right? Are you going to be expecting the old system to get decommissioned, or is that a separate project? Are you expecting to be able to use the data from the legacy system to compare with the new system? Are you going to want to do year-on-year comparisons? What is it that you're expecting, right? Are you going to take over your integrations? Are you going to come up with new integrations? Some definition of the vision, and then also the more detailed business goals and then the business scope and requirements. We see very often that the business requirements or the data migration requirements are well defined, but the surrounding topics are not always that well defined. What is the impact on other teams? What is the impact on other systems? What is it that the senior management team is expecting out of this cutover? What are the sponsors expecting out of this? And then some principles, right? Define these early in the initiate phase. Is this going to be a business-driven cutover, right? Not just in name, but in reality. Is there going to be a resource made available that is the cutover leader that's going to essentially corral all the different business users that are needed for cleaning the data, for approvals, for ownership of the data validation. Who is going to liaise with the wider business to make sure all of those threads connect together? Who's going to make sure that all the different parts of the project are going to come together as well? Is it going to be business driven? That's a key question you should be asking, and the answer should then drive how the strategy is put together. Is it going to be a repeatable, scalable, multiple rollout type of vision for this cutover, or is it a one-off, right? And then if we need to go live in another country or in another phase, we'll think about it again. Who's going to drive the ownership of the data? Who's going to own that the data remains secure throughout the project? Is that going to be done through the cutover leader as a single point of contact through which all of these things get done? Or are we going to distribute all of this into different areas? And having these principles, having this vision defined, getting a singular cutover leader, having this defined early on, helps the data migration team also with their strategy. How should they be planning it? And it helps with the strategy as to how you manage this with the wider business, with the implementation partners, etc. One of the key things you'll be finding as part of the vision is, what is the allowable shutdown window that the business is going to give you? Makes a big difference if the business says you've got 4 hours on a Sunday in order to do the cutover, or you've got 4 days, including a long weekend. There are very different techniques you're going to have to use if you've got 4 hours as opposed to 4 days. And knowing that and getting that defined early on as part of your cutover vision is important, so you're not stumbling into that halfway through the project. And once you've got that, high-level vision, you've got your business requirements defined, you've got some scope definition. This is still early days, right? You don't know all the answers to everything. You don't have all the details of the entity definitions, etc. This is still in the early days of the initiate, maybe just into starting implementation. And our recommendation is very early on, create a business-focused cutover calendar. And by that mean, there's a couple of examples. Right? These are real customer examples that we've obviously cleaned up and simplified so we can show on the screen here. But essentially what it's saying is, around the time of the cutover, what are the business activities that are going to be going on that could impact that cutover, right? What is it that's happening? What's the framework within which this cutover needs to happen? And this is a really important thing that you're going to be doing at the beginning. You may not know all the details of how the technical migration will work, but what are the business activities that are going to be happening. If it's a finance application that you're taking live, then you're going to be doing month-end accounting. You're going to be doing AP shutdown, AR shutdown, etc. There are things that are going to be happening around that time that every business is going to be doing. So how does your cutover impact on those? And having that defined in simple business language, starting off with a very simple picture and evolving that as you know more, is a very good way of getting some good framework for the cutover definition. And I'll go through some of the reasons that we've seen across multiple projects why this works, the benefits that you get from it. The first and probably one of the biggest benefits is that it provides it's an ideal means of communication between the business and the project. Very often the cutover itself, or at least the data migration paths, can get very technical. There's a complex environment management you need to do, there are complex technical steps you need to do, and it's quite disconnected sometimes from how the business operates or what the business understands. So having that business-focused calendar provides a means for you to communicate with the business in language they understand. It can help direct the cutover strategy because you're now starting to understand the constraints and the requirements within which that data, that final data migration, that final cutover needs to happen. It allows the project to talk about things to the business that the business may not be aware of, and vice versa. They may be telling the project, here are some of the the constraints and requirements we have that the project may not be aware of. It also engages the business early, and it starts the relationship off in a good way, right? You're engaging the business sponsors, the business data owners at a very early stage. You're telling them what's happening, you're telling them what the cutover is going to mean, and they're telling you what it does mean to you in terms of the business activities. And it stops cutover being a purely technical exercise. It starts to become a much more business-owned, business-driven exercise where data migration then becomes a means to an end in terms of delivery of the transition of the system. So when you're looking at your kind of more detailed cutover strategy now, so your strategy is evolving. You may not know all the answers at the beginning, but you're starting to put more flesh on the bones as you go through the implement phase. You've already got your scope, your requirements, you've got your dependencies defined. Some of them are technical dependencies on entities, some are more business requirement dependencies. You've got a business calendar of activities, not just data migration, but things that are happening in the business around the time of go live. You've got your definition of roles and responsibilities in the strategy, and this is especially important in the context of a cutover leader, right? Your cutover leader is not replacing the role of a data migration lead, right? A data migration lead tends to have some very special and specific skills to be able to drive a at least a complex data migration through. Cutover leader is somebody from the business that is actually pulling all the threads together, but they need to understand what is going to be their role compared to the role of the data migration lead. What is their role compared to the role of the project manager? What is their role in comparison to the role of the business sponsor? So having that definition early on helps to make sure everybody understands where their responsibilities lie and where the overlap exists. You'll have a high-level cutover plan where you'll be defining what are the points at which you're going to do your mock cutovers, where you're going to do your data migration trials, when are you going to have data needed for testing, training, etc. And you're going to start your more detailed go-live cutover plan, right? When you first start in the implement phase, it may not be very well flushed out, but you're starting it at this point because you want to set the right tone, the right formal discipline for what needs to happen at the formal go-live cutover. You'd be defining what reconciliations you're going to need to do, how you're going to make sure that the data that's come over from the current legacy systems over to Dynamics is accurate and fit for use in the new system. You'll have some definition of an environment management plan. What environments will you need to move the data into? Where are you going to do your validations? Where are you going to do your performance testing? And so on. And lastly, and importantly, you're going to look at the impact of this cutover on related systems, right? Not just Dynamics, but when you put Dynamics live, you're likely to be disturbing the landscape, the enterprise landscape around Dynamics. There may be other systems that are impacted, integrations that change, the methods of communication between systems might change. You may have new security definitions that come in place. So you identifying the owners of these other systems to make sure that they are aware of what is happening with the Dynamics go live, and they start to take some responsibility for making sure that their systems are going to respond in the right way and they're ready for this go live. So it's not just on the core project team to be doing all of this. So now that you've got an overview of what is in that cutover strategy, let's dive a little deeper into data migration considerations. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the data migration topic, or at least the technical topics, because that's covered in other tech talks or the documentation. What we're going to be touching upon here is how does it relate to the overall cutover strategy? What are the kind of key touch points you should be thinking about from an overall cutover perspective, right? So we're going to break it down and we'll go into a little bit more detail on the topics there, on the source systems, target system, mapping and transformation, data loading, and the validation. And across, we're going to talk briefly about the process, the roles and responsibilities, the planning that is required from a data migration perspective, both at a macro level and then at a sprint, or if you're in a waterfall, at a phase level. And then most importantly, we're going to also talk about the iterative performance management that you need to think about from a data migration perspective, all hopefully ending up in a fit for purpose target system. And I'm using the word target system deliberately rather than Dynamics 365 business application, because sometimes there's more than one system that is going live at that point. So you may need to be thinking about some of the new systems to which you're integrating, as well as Dynamics 365 application. So we'll go into a little bit more detail in each of these areas. Again, I'll repeat myself. I won't go into too much detail into each one of these. We've taken the route of adding a bit more content into each of these slides, so you can go away and read about them and come back with any questions. I won't read everything that's on the slide deck. I'll just pick out a couple of topics on each slide. So in the source data management, data cleansing is probably the most important thing that we wanted to highlight. And a couple of very common risks that we observe. Number one is lack of data readiness delaying go lives. You know, I suspect if we did an analysis across multiple different projects, lack of data readiness will be pretty much at the top of the reasons for delays to go live. The other common risk that we see is poor quality of migrated data causing issues in go live. So you've gone live and now the business is picking out the implications of bad data in the production system. And of course, it doesn't all come from bad data in the source system, right? There are multiple places when things can go wrong in the transformation, configuration, etc. But what we're seeing is most often, and for the most critical issues, it tends to be traced all the way back to having bad data at source that's gone somehow through the engine and landed in the Dynamics application. So I wanted to call out those two risks specifically because as a project, we need to do something special and specific to manage those risks and not just accept them as life, right? And a couple of mitigations. One is making sure that the data cleansing at source is business owned. It's very well defined in terms of what do we mean by data cleansing, what is good enough quality, that it's well managed, and we as a project can provide them with some tooling and some monitoring to make sure that the data quality is something that you can actually assess and you can monitor the progress. You can track that the cleansing of the data in the source system is likely to complete within the time period that you need it to. And sometimes this is difficult because statements of work, etc., where the project says the data cleansing is a responsibility of the business. We as a project team are going to focus on delivery of the functional requirements. The partner's SOW is saying that we're responsible for delivering the designs and coding, and the data cleansing and the ownership of the data falls between the cracks. From a project perspective, it's absolutely in your interest that data cleansing gets done well. So if you need to help to get that data cleansing toolkit well defined, well managed, it's worth your effort to say, how do I embed this within my project approach? What do I need to do to make sure that data cleansing and source data quality is taken up as a key part of the delivery of this project? So what does it mean, for example, if you're taking customer records over? What does it mean for a customer record to be clean? Right? What is the minimum data quality it needs to meet in order for you to even extract it and take it through the data migration engine? And you need to be quite tough in terms of these standards, because the amount of time projects waste trying to clean up data in the engine at the target system, when it's most often much better to fix the problem at source. Of course, sometimes that is not possible, but you should do everything you can to try and fix the problem as close to the source as you possibly can. And for that, you need to have a very clear definition of this customer record in this legacy system. If it does not have these attributes, we are not picking it up. It's not coming over into the new system. If it does not meet these criteria, it's not going to come over until it meets the following criteria. You may have incremental data quality requirements where you say, well, it's met the minimum bar for the first round, for the first cycle of data migration, but before we take it in the next cycle, it needs to have the following attributes well defined. So you may have incremental data quality requirements, and that's fine, as long as they are well defined and the responsibility for making sure that those criteria are met are with the right people. Think about that for large volume entities, that you have some means of being able to do incremental load so that the extract of very large amount of data from the source system does not become a performance hindrance at the final cutover. That you're not sitting there waiting 8 hours while you're extracting 1 million records from a legacy system. Right? Have some definition of what you need to do if the data extraction requirement from source system is very large. Maybe you do it in pieces or you do it in some other way. Right? So next we're going to talk about the target system, and for this purpose we're going to talk about Dynamics 365 apps in particular. And one of the most common risks we see is that the data that's migrated into Dynamics 365 is often not sufficiently usable by the project until it's very late. Sometimes even as late as user acceptance testing. Well, that's a real shame because it means that the project can't help the data migration team with validating the data as it's coming through. If it's not usable, people won't take the time and effort to actually validate it through business transactions, validate it to make sure it's meeting the needs of the target system. Right? So make sure that does not become a risk for your project. Take specific means to make sure that you are taking data into the target system that is usable right from the very start. Right? Now, of course, its usability may be limited in the first iteration, but you need to get it to be fully usable much earlier than user acceptance testing. One of the other things that we see is that the scope of the data migration is often defined in technical terms of data entities, number of records, attributes, etc. And we strongly encourage you to think of the scope of data migration. The target system is defined not just at that level, but also at the level of how it's going to be used in the production system. Right? What is its end use when it arrives in the target system? What are the minimum standards that it needs to meet before it's accepted into the dynamic system? Again, you should have another gate at the other end. So we are not even going to load this record if it does not meet the following criteria. And that's important because, again, you can waste a lot of your own time as a data migration team putting data over that is not meeting minimum requirements. And you can waste time of the project where they're getting stuck and they're finding errors because the data is not good enough to transact on. Right? So set those minimum standards, be explicit. It's okay if they're incremental, that you are expected to, for example, with a customer record, get deeper and deeper as you go through the cycles, but make sure it meets some minimum bar and it's not arbitrary, right? That it's meaningful in the target system. It's very important in terms of usability that you think of the breadth of the record before you think of the depth. So it's better to have 20 customer records that are migrated cleanly than 2,000 that you can't use. Similarly, if you've got 20 but they are only they're only in customer group A and you're not yet ready to migrate maybe those in customer group B or C because they're more complex customer hierarchies or some other complication, even that is preferable because you've got something meaningful, well-defined, that's usable. It's okay then in the next iteration to bring in the more complex data. Very often we see data migration progress reported as, we've got 500,000 records here, they've got 700 attributes, and we are bringing over 89% of the attributes over into the target system. People pat themselves on the back, but that is not meaningful if that data is not usable at the other end, right? You need to look up on your progress very much in terms of usability of that data that's landed at the other end, not just a technical movement from A to B. Pay attention to the design changes, right? The behavior we very often see is that the functional project team sometimes does not keep the data migration team well informed in terms of design changes, and they get wrong-footed in terms of their delivery. Just when they think they're making progress, suddenly the next iteration of data migration takes a step backwards. And it's because something changed in the design, they were not aware of it, they're migrating to a target design that no longer exists. So make sure you're involved in that definition, make sure that communication is well defined and that you're not getting caught up in those loops, right? Mapping and transformation, again, this is something that very often happens within the bowels of the data migration team, and not a lot of visibility surfaces up to the business users or even to the project team. And what we see is if that transformation and mapping definition and those rules are not defined in a way that can be reviewed by the business data owners and they don't understand what is getting transformed, there are hidden errors that arrive all the way into the production system, and then you end up having to unpick the root cause of something not working in a production system. So the strong recommendation is where you've got transformation and mapping rules, make them explicit, share them with the business data owners so they understand what is happening to that data. Make sure they understand why you need to do it, what you're doing with it, how it's going to be better, how it's going to be fit for purpose in the target system, and make sure they're involved in that process so that it's clearly visible and you catch any of those kind of hidden errors early on in the project. Plan for incremental validation of that mapping and transformation, because again, you don't have all the answers right at the beginning, right? The transformation engine, the mapping engine also does tend to evolve as the project becomes clearer and clearer and more designs are clearer, right? But plan that into your delivery, plan that as part of the cutover definition, not just as part of the data migration, not just as part of the data migration delivery. And the end result you want is very clear rules to move the data from the source system to the target system, right? Another mitigation we would kind of recommend is don't try and automate transformations where the rules are vague, where the business cannot give you clear definition of how that transformation should work. It actually ends up creating more problems than it solves. There's only two paths you can take. You can say we can't take that data over because the rules are not clear, or you have to get the rules simplified, even if it means some compromises, so you can automate it because it's high volume. Leaving it in between where the rules are vague and you're still trying to automate it with the hope that somewhere along the line it's going to become clearer is a road to nowhere, right? Be firm, be clear that this needs to be explicit, otherwise it's going to create more problems. Some recommendations on the loading of the data, right? Some of this is going to be stuff you know already. Some of it, I would say, we continually see not the best practice, right? And one of them is setting explicit performance goals for the data loads based on the time that you've actually got to do your final go live, right? So if your cutover window is a weekend and the customer data load out of that, you've got 2 hours, make sure that as part of your mock cutovers, your trial data migration runs, you're actually able to do that in 2 hours. More to the point, moving the system from start to finish is actually going to happen within that 2-day window and includes business validation, etc. We often see projects where they say, well, actually take the From start to finish, the cutover takes us 4 weeks at the moment, right? And somehow magically, by the time you arrive at go live, it's going to get squeezed down into 2 days. Well, no, there needs to be an explicit plan as to how you're going to go from what you're doing today to a 2-day window, right? You need to bear in mind that this is a means to an end, right? You've constantly got to be looking at whether or not your performance is going to meet the expectations at the end of this cycle. Target system validation, I won't go into all of these. The key point I will point out is we very often see behavior where the data migration team says, our role is to take data from source to target. We've landed it there, and based on the rules we've been given, we've verified it, we've validated it, the data's good, we're done. It's over to you, business team. It's over to you, project team, to go validate that data within the, within the target system, that it works in the way you expect it to, right? And strictly speaking, often that is the remit that's given to the data migration team or the cutover team. The reality is that it's in your interest to make sure that validation is stretched out to make sure that data is usable in business transactions in the target system, because that's the real meaning of that data having arrived correctly. It is no good saying that I have 500 records in source, I have 500 records in target. If it's not usable, nobody wins, right? And sometimes it means you have to borrow resources from the functional team to say they're going to conduct the business transactions to make sure that the data landed in the target system is clean and good. But whatever means you do it by, I would strongly encourage you to think of that data migration cycle, or that mock cutover cycle, is not complete until the data is validated to make sure it's fit for purpose in the target system, right? And again, we could talk all day about this, right? And I won't go into any more detail. We need to kind of keep moving on. But if you have further questions, if you think it's worth, having a separate tech talk on some of the data migration topics, let us know in your feedback, and we'll see if we can put something else together. So as we're approaching the cutover window, as we're getting into the prepare phase, we need to kind of maybe switch gears and start to think about the more detailed cutover plan, the readiness of that detailed cutover plan, etc. So I want to talk a little bit about the cutover planning. So I want to separate the planning into 2 pieces: the very high level cutover project plan, and then the more detailed, final go live cutover plan. And those are very different beasts, right? So let's start with the high level cutover plan. By that we mean the plan that is part of the project plan and describes the key milestones with effort, resources, and dependencies, and it's tied to other project milestones like SIT, SAT, UAT, training, etc. So you're expected to meet interim milestones within the project in order to deliver the right quality of data, the right data entities for the different stages within the, within the project. And that's what I mean by the high level cutover plan, right? The environment plan, how you're going to have your production environment ready, when is that going to be ready, when are you going to have your staging environment ready, that kind of thing. And some do's and don'ts. And again, I'm not going to read through all of them. I'm going to pick out a couple. One of them is set the cutover discipline from the start and plan for multiple cutovers, right? And I've put 5 to 7. It really depends on the complexity of your cutover, right? For very simple cutovers, you may not need that many. You may be able to get away with 2 or 3, but for most business application cutovers, you will find that you need more than you might anticipate at the beginning of the project. And make sure that each time you're exercising them in the way that reflects what you're going to actually do when you go to production, right? It's no good having a shortcut where you're practicing something just to get data from A to B for a test cycle, because you're not practicing what you're going to do for production use, right? That can be misleading. It can also reduce the effectiveness of that or the meaningfulness of that test cycle because you've done something special. You're not going to repeat when you do your production go live. Don't underestimate the complexity, right? Cutover is moving off an entire business system. It's complex. There's lots of moving parts. There are a lot of things that happen in a cutover that you may not be able to think of in one go right at the beginning of the project. Pay attention to this. If you need specialist help, go get some specialist help. Go find somebody who's done it before to make sure that you know how to plan for this. And then we'll talk a little bit about the detailed go live cutover plan. Again, this is, I'm not going to read through all of this, right? It's essentially the very detailed set of tasks that you need to define in order to transition from the old system to the new system. And this is related to the go live weekend or whatever your shutdown period is, where you've got very detailed, very specific task level definition of the plan. 8:05, I'm going to be doing this. 8:15, I'm going to be doing this. 8:25, I'm going to be doing this. Very detailed definition of the final cutover plan. And when should you start it? As early as possible. In the early days, of course, it's just going to be a skeleton, right? It's going to be a shell with some placeholders. But as you go through the implement phase, you should be filling this out into more and more detail. And it should be ready by the time you are going to be doing user acceptance testing. You really want to exercise your cutover plan prior to user acceptance testing, because that's a very good test of your mock cutover. And when you go through user acceptance testing, you can say that the results of the user acceptance testing are very valid because this is exactly the process that we're going to adopt for our go live cutover, right? If you've got big differences between what you did to get data over for UAT as opposed to what you're going to do for go live, you're reducing the meaning of UAT. You can't extrapolate so easily now because you're doing something different, right? The rule really you should be going by is, I don't want to be doing anything at the final go live cutover that have not practiced and got right before. Right? The risk otherwise is too high. And why? Right? Because usually you have very little room for error. You've got a very fixed amount of time to transition for the final cutover. You've got to get it right. You get normally one shot at doing that final go live. If you get it wrong, the implications are pretty serious. Either you have to defer the go live at the last second, which is not something anybody wants to see, or you end up with a production system which has got a lot of issues. Right? Neither of those are good outcomes. Right? And that's why it's important to do, a detailed cutover plan. Again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I want to go through the remote go live steps as well. We will share the kind of empty detailed cutover plan template if there is sufficient demand for it. If you would like to see the Excel spreadsheet that I'm going through here, please let us know and we will make it available at the same time as the Tech Talk document. Right? I went through all the columns. Essentially what this is the subset of the columns that we say you should be thinking about having for every single step, for the definition of the step itself, right? What is the step? What is it dependent on? What does it depend with? What area is it in? Who's assigned this step? What is the status of the step? Who is the backup that could execute this step? This step is complex and it requires 5 or 6 very complex or very specialist technical things that somebody's going to do in the background. You may not want to write all 5 steps here, but you may want to put a link to the document that defines it in the step here, but putting all of that under change control and formally documenting it. The rule being that the final cutover, there should be nothing that you're doing to the system that is not in this plan. Right? Everything you're going to be doing for the cutover should be defined in this step-by-step definition. Right? These two sections is essentially just a continuation of that spreadsheet that we started, right? Where you are tracking the start time, end time, and duration of each of the steps during your mocks and your rehearsals, right? And the reason you're doing that is because you're building up a realistic plan for how long it's actually going to take you when you go live in production, right? And don't make assumptions, right? Make sure that your rehearsal is a reflection of the real go live, because then you can genuinely say, this is a realistic plan. This is what we've practiced. I know I can do this within, within 40 hours, leaving me an 8-hour contingency on the final go live weekend, right? Make sure that you can do this so that you can proactively manage any areas of risk before you go to your real go live cutover. And during your go live cutover on the left-hand side, the reason you're tracking it to this level of detail is because you know what your plan is. Your plan is for this step to take 15 minutes. If it's taking half an hour and still not complete, you should be starting to think, is there something that's not quite right? What do I need to do to get back on track? Do I need to make sure somebody goes, looks at this? Are there any logs being created? Is it blocked in some way? It gives you early signs so that you can start to plan how you recover, right? It also allows you to communicate with downstream tasks to make sure that those are not starting too early, that you are making sure that you're dealing with the issue before it gets too bad. And again, continuation of that same spreadsheet, some means within the spreadsheet itself of allowing you to manage the impact of a step that's failing, step that's not completing on time, just a common shared view of where everybody that's on a cutover, and often these can be a lot of people, can get a snapshot view of that cutover status, right? We often see some pushback from some projects saying, well, why do I need it to be that detailed? I know what I'm doing. This is really not that complicated. We'll be fine, right? And experience tells us that that is often not the case. You're not fine, right? It's a complex thing you're doing, and a detailed cutover plan gives you a higher level of confidence that when you are doing this for real, for the final cutover, you are going to be able to deliver on time and accurately the cutover. Again, I won't go through all of them, but one of the reasons why we've put a bit more text in here that you can take this away and kind of have a look at your own cutover thinking, right? I'm going to move on to the kind of remote go live. And when there is a remote go live, there are some things that start to become a bit more important just because it's remote, as opposed to if you're all in a single conference room or a couple of conference room and you're able to kind of, just walk over to somebody's desk and talk to somebody, read their body language, essentially have that communication, right? So here are some of the additional risks to manage that we have seen across multiple remote go lives. Right now, a remote go live is absolutely possible, right? We've seen multiple remote go lives happen in this kind of COVID era, and they've been successful, right? But they've not been without challenges. And here's some of the learnings from some of them, right? I won't read all of them. I'll pick out a couple. Probably one of those I want to pick out is kind of the team personalities that you see on the go live cutover weekend, right? You've got a cutover leader. They're walking through the cutover. They're saying step 2 is finished. Okay, now it's step 3. Joe, off you go, right? Mary, hold off until step 3 is finished. Mary, step 3 is finished. Off you go, right? There's somebody coordinating this. But you need feedback, right? It's not just one way. And what we see is that you've got different personalities in a remote situation. You've got your hermits. These are people that don't say anything at all, right? They're very quiet. They know what they're doing. And if only they'd spoken up, you could have avoided an issue, right? Then you've got the squeaky wheels that consume, most of the oxygen in the room. They're always talking, they're always interrupting other people, their task is always at the forefront, and their task or their area may not be the most critical thing to discuss at the time. It's just their personality, right? They overwhelm that cutover channel. And it's important that you manage that. Then you got your ghosts, right? The people that at the beginning of the session, they're all there, they're saying, yeah, I'm here. But just as you need to talk to them, you say, we're in step 17 now, it's over to David or to Jane, and they're not on Teams, right? You eventually reach them, and this is a real story, and you find that they're in the supermarket with their kids, right? Sorry, I got caught in traffic. I didn't think it would take this long. I didn't think it would be a big issue. Don't worry, I'll be back in the next hour, right? And they may have a critical step, and the entire cutover is stopped until they can get back to their desk and do their task, right? So make sure you're managing these expectations. You know who these personalities are within your organization. I bet you could probably point to those people in your own cutover team, right? So make sure you have a means to manage these different personalities. If you're all in a room, in a conference room, it's much easier. When you're remote, you have to do some specific things, right? And I will go through some of these in a bit more detail over the next slides. Ownership and organization. I strongly recommend you to think of the cutover weekend or the cutover delivery of whatever period as an organization, a temporary organization, but an organization. You've got a cutover leader, you've got multiple other people that are involved in the doing, you've got multiple people involved in approving, you've got multiple people making decisions. You are forming a team, right? This is an organization, and treat it like that, because there are multiple benefits that come from treating it as an organization rather than just a loose collection of people that happen to have come together for the cutover, right? Strongly recommend you have a strong leader that coordinates the multiple teams in that go live weekend, right? That's not necessarily the same person that was the cutover leader, right? Often it is, but it's not necessarily. This is a kind of a sergeant major type of personality, right? They are directing traffic, they are very firm, they're very clear, they're saying step 17, yes, go. Nobody does anything until they get a signal. Say step 17, yes, go. Step 18, hold. Step 19, where are you at, right? They coordinate the whole thing. Now, they've got a dashboard and they're making it visible to everybody, but they are coordinating the whole thing through one person. Obviously, you probably have a substitute as well, because no one person is going to work through, 48 hour cutover. Appoint an area level issue manager and a leader. So for example, if your cutover includes finance, manufacturing, customer engagement, make sure you've got somebody who are managing each of those specialist teams, so that you've got somebody to go to for decisions, approvals. Also think of having an issues manager that essentially picks up the issue and deals with the issue without disturbing the rest of the team and what they're doing. Absolutely critical that you double check and confirm the agreements with all the stakeholders for the availability of the resources that you're expecting for the go live cutover period. Often this is during holiday periods or weekends, certainly out of office hours. And you'd be surprised how many people then don't turn up because the commitment is so loose that they feel that they can do other things and just turn up as and when they're ready, right? So you need to reinforce that commitment. Make sure you've got at least one senior stakeholder is available throughout the cutover period for any emergency decisions, any resource requirements, any cost implications, quality implications, business implications that you can reach out to immediately, right? When you've got a remote cutover, it's even more important that the steps are detailed and precise, right? You've got to have a better definition of responsibility, because you can't just chat to each other over over a desk. Push for a buddy system where possible, because it's very often very helpful, especially for critical tasks. When one person is doing the task, somebody's checking, right? So two people who could do it. For very critical tasks, it often relieves a lot of the pressure and the stress from a person doing some very critical stuff, right? It often avoids errors that come about because people are stressed in what they're doing, right? They've got 40, 50 people's eyes on them and they have something critical to do. It's of course not always possible to have a buddy system, right? So try if you can, right? I won't go through all of these. I've deliberately kind of written them up in a way that you should be able to read them offline. Here's an example of a resource calendar with commitments. Available means they are literally there on Teams within 30 seconds. On standby means they respond within 5 minutes and they're at their desk working within 15 minutes, right? And not available essentially means you can't rely on them at all. They are not available, full stop, right? Have something very specific, very defined in terms of resource availability, right? Here's a kind of an example of an efficient team, right? Somebody who coordinates. You've got your area leaders that have expertise in that particular discipline, IT, data migration, customer engagement, finance, etc., and an issues manager that doesn't allow the issues to clog up the central communication channel for the cutover, but essentially works offline to make sure issues are getting resolved and communicates back to the coordinator to say, this is an issue, we need to stop, or this is an issue, we're working on it, the rest can continue, right? Technical preparation, there are lots of things that can go wrong when you're remote, right? Now, given that a lot of us have been working remotely, some of the risks are reduced because we've ironed out the issues, over the initial period in terms of remote access, right? But remember that for the go live cutover, you're often requiring access to production systems. So when you've been exercising, you may not have done exercises with production legacy system or production dynamic system, and the rules may be slightly different. So make sure that you've got all of that ironed out before you walk into the final go live. Right? I won't go into the human factors. I think we've talked about it a bit more, but do make sure you pay attention to some of these, right? The cutover is not just about the technology. You do have to take into account how people behave when they're remote. It's not the same as if you're all in one room, right? Very often we found issues where somebody's in deep trouble, their task is not going well, they're stuck, but because they're remote, it's not visible to you, right? You're not seeing it. So make sure that you create opportunity as a cutover leader, as an area leader, to explicitly check with all team members regularly to make sure that things are going well. Ask the question, where are you at with this, right? Don't ask, is everything okay? You're likely to get the answer yes, without actually them confessing or saying, no, I'm stuck, I'm having real issues here, right? Don't forget, cutover very often is post-go live. Steps also needed. You also need to think about the issues that emerge after go live, right? As a cutover team, you bear some responsibility for making sure you help with resolution of issues that may have been caused by the cutover, either bad data or bad configuration move or something that was caused as part of the cutover, right? You cannot just dissolve the cutover organization and team at the moment the go live happens. Think about how long you need to keep them. Think about having explicit exit criteria. Think about a hypercare period for the cutover team, again with explicit exit criteria, because you need to make sure that the user adoption sticks, and you as a cutover team can help enormously in terms of helping the end users understand, yeah, that's a genuine data issue, or no, it's just a misunderstanding on how the system works, right? I won't go through the takeaway because I'm at the end of my hour. I will leave you with our contact details. Please feel free, if you have specific questions, if you have a specific request, to email us and ask us specific questions. Otherwise, I'd like to ask you to kind of fill out the survey form and let us know what more you would like to see, if you'd like us to do a deeper dive on anything. Okay, I will stop now and hand back to Erin.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I posted a link to the short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd love to get your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. Thank you in advance for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter and to our moderators, and of course to the audience for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you may be.